हाँ ऐसे पढ़ने के लिए
a public practice.
और ये mic use करोगे?
Yes.
Hi everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Sorry, I think they turned on your mic as well. So let's start with the program at a glance. So there were some changes to the program after the program was printed. So just want to make sure that you have those. So we're going to start with Smitha's keynote in a few minutes, but after that we'll have a break and then the paper session. The last set of open sessions are happening at noon or about 12:15, let's say. And there's going to be 3 sessions, not 4, because the last set of coordinators couldn't be here. And so these are going to be the Gary Marsden Memorial Session with their ICTD, the Gender Equality in the Indian IT Workplace, and that's also the session that Smitha will be a discussant at. So if you want to listen to more from her after the keynote, then you can head over there. And then the last one is Intersectional Computing for Technology and Development, and that's a bunch of us from Georgia Tech and IIIT Delhi, and we'll be discussing kind of theory and practice in the context of intersectionality. So that's the open sessions. And then we have another set of papers being presented in the afternoon, after which we have the poster session, which will be just outside where you've seen where the posters are. And at 7 p.m. is when we have the banquet and the cultural performance. And I was asked to give a little bit of a clarification on the cultural performance, just in case you guys want to kind of consider whether you're attending. So Prahlad Singh Tipanyaji, who's going to be performing with his troupe, he's really kind of very well known across India, but also in other parts of the world. And this fame kind of started with the Kabir project back in 2009, when a bunch of folks from Srishti in Bangalore, it's a school of design, they put together 4 films on Kabir and different aspects of Kabir. And Kabir was a 14th century mystic poet. And, you know, along the lines of, say, Rumi and Hafiz, his poetry has been quite highly regarded, specifically in the case of, you know, caste politics, regional politics, bringing up the tension between, you know, Hinduism and Islam, because Kabir has been considered to be both Hindu and Muslim by different folks. And so it's really, you'll see all of this come out, and you'll also see translations of this music. And, you know, my own PhD actually started with doing field work around the space of the Kabir project, and so I've interacted with them fairly deeply, and I just wanted to kind of say that you won't regret being there. Really, it's super powerful. Prahlad is really great at kind of doing the translation from the poetry to the meaning of it, and has really incredible stage presence. So don't think of that as just a musical performance that we've put together, but really it's very much part of the agenda and part of the message that we want to convey with the conference. So hopefully you'll make it there. And so that would be it. And yeah, there will be a large banquet along with that. And that's it for the program for today. I will go ahead and start with introducing Smitha. So Smitha is really someone that I've known now many years and have held in high regard for just how great she is at literally everything she does. And I'll say a little bit about her research, teaching, and also her dance. And I've seen her perform. She's amazing. But let's starting with the research. So Smitha is Associate Professor of Sociology and Luella Lamer Associate Professor of Women's Studies at Wellesley College. Her research looks at the cultural, financial, and political dimensions of gender and globalization, with particular focus on India, United States, and South Africa. Her current project uses microfinance as a window into newly dominant anti-poverty practices that merge profit motivations with the social ones. Drawing from ethnographic work, interviews with commercial microfinance institutions, their clients, their employees, their funders, she shows how gendered labor and class inequalities shape access to finance and entrench gendered livelihoods in the context of a polarized service economy. Articles from this project have appeared in World Development, Science, and Economic Anthropology, among others. Her book manuscript, tentatively titled When Women Pay Up, Making Financial Citizens in India, is currently in process. Smitha's book, Appropriately Indian, Gender and Culture in a Transnational Class, is a multi-sided ethnographic study of transnational Indian IT workers. It came out in 2011 and argues that gendered arrangements within educated, upwardly mobile IT families give this elite group disproportionate power in defining what it means to be Indian in the global economy. Prior to this book, her research looked at the cultural politics of post-apartheid South Africa, based on extensive research with South African Indian communities and in Durban and its surrounding townships. What I was really excited to learn about was actually her teaching, which I'll talk about now. So Smitha teaches courses on globalization, race, gender, nationalism, diaspora, and development at all levels of the curricula. Her courses give students an opportunity to think deeply about social difference in the context of an interconnected, albeit fragmented world, and locate themselves within a global political economy structured by inequalities. And as part of her broader vision for what a truly global public sociology might look like, she taught a MOOC in 2014 on the edX platform called Introduction to Global Sociology. She created original course materials through traveling to many cities in the US and to the UK to film on-site shoots and interviews with scholars and everyday people. With the support of a production team at Wellesley and at MIT, she produced about 150 videos that became the material for this course. And when it launched, 35,000 students were registered from over 100 countries, which I think is amazing. Since then, the course has been broken up into 3 self-paced modules that are still on the edX platform: Global Sociology, Global Inequality, and Global Social Change. Students around the world continue to access these materials, and she uses them in her classes at Wellesley. And for Smitha, this course aimed to reframe sociology as a way of thinking about the world that's relevant to everyone. At the time that it launched, she was also one of the few women, and maybe the only woman of color, on the platform. When Smitha is not teaching or writing, she performs and promotes classical and contemporary Indian dance forms, especially Bharatanatyam, which she's been doing since she was 5, so longer than she's been a sociologist, as she said. She's a member of the Navrasa Dance Theatre and serves on their board. She's also established the Natya Dance Studio in Natick, Massachusetts, through which she offers classes for children and adults and performs locally. With that, I'd like to invite Smitha up for her keynote. Thank you so much for coming. We're really delighted to have you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. This is a little too loud. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to Neha for the wonderful introduction, and to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. It's really an honor, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with all of you about my long-term work. So in this talk, I'm actually putting together both the projects that Neha mentioned. That was the request from the organizers. So this will be a broader talk that I hope can get across some of the bigger ideas that I have about the work, and I'm eager for your feedback and comments. Okay, so I want to start with hearing a little bit from all of you. Women's empowerment, right? It's this kind of big, amorphous thing. Some of you, it may inspire some eye-rolling among gender and development scholars. It may be mysterious, but if people could just shout out or give me some ideas about what it is. So what does it connote for you right now in 2019, right, when we've had a few decades of this kind of discourse? What are some of the things that? What's that? Smash the patriarchy. Okay, so there is a kind of renewed emphasis where now we have like good taglines like persist, smash the patriarchy, right, that are an updated version of women's empowerment. What are some of the other things that come to mind? Okay, so if women's empowerment is realized, then men and women will be the same somehow, perhaps, and what would that look like? Women smarter than men. Okay, so there's this really interesting, actually I have a paper about this, there's this really interesting sense that somehow if we empower women, then perhaps men are failing, or men are not as good, or men are somehow, there's an idea, there's a set of fears and anxieties about that, right? Or maybe women, or as you said, maybe women are just smarter to begin with, and somehow that will be realized through this, right? So lots of contradictory ideas. What else? Oh, okay, awesome. So if we have women's empowerment, then maybe women will speak up first in social gatherings. Maybe they will ask the question at the end of the academic session instead of being the last one, right? So women still don't ask questions, right, at the end. So maybe we'll have everyday situations in which we will speak up before others. Anything else? Anyone exhausted by this term? Like, can we stop talking about this already? Oh, sorry, we're here in the front. I haven't heard from you. Anyone exhausted? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So here's the fear that that women's empowerment agenda, right, will actually advance incompetent women. That they will be advanced unfairly in that context. What else? Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. So women's empowerment as a way of that transitioning us perhaps to a world where men and women both have a full set of choices about their livelihoods, their reproductive lives, right? A whole set of different concerns that constitute our everyday lives, right? And indeed, how do we work towards that? Okay, so we have from all of these responses a pretty varied set of sensibilities over who women's empowerment is relevant to, how would it actually work, perhaps some fears and anxieties around it, right? So now I want to pivot a little bit more specifically to the history of women's empowerment in India. And indeed, there's a very storied history, right, of women's empowerment in India, and it's worth reflecting upon the context-specific history of this term within India, right? So starting in the 70s, you have a whole range of social movements that embrace this discourse of empowerment. So peasant movements, leftist movements, Dalit movements, feminist movements, a whole range of these movements. And what unifies them, right, is a conviction about marginalized voices really coming to the center in order to make a commentary about perhaps the failure or the shortcomings of modernization, right? And really trying to articulate a critique in contemporary India, right, about the way that certain anti-poverty agendas are going, right? So it's a kind of a radical voice. And that is pervasive throughout. It picks up in the 70s and it gains steam. And then NGOs, right, start to take this up. And during the same period, you have things like very successful adult literacy campaigns, right, informal education, reaching out to women to improve. And those are all very successful, right? And so you see a kind of adaptation of the energy of some of these social movements in the NGO space. Now, slowly, the IGOs, the intergovernmental organizations, the World Banks of the world come into play, right? And now you start to see a little bit of a co-optation of that discourse, right? You see an institution like the World Bank taking these counter-hegemonic discourses, right, and sort of folding them into their policy and programming, and they're trying to accommodate the criticisms and critiques of feminist scholars in particular, and are saying, we need to think about gender in all these different aspects. It's still sort of marginalized in their programming if you look at World Bank programming during this time period, right? But you start to see why we have some of these tensions because of the way this plays out. But World Bank attention to women's empowerment definitely becomes an issue in India, right? And then finally in the 80s, right, state efforts in India start to take up empowerment as an explicit aim. So starting, Aradhana Sharma, the anthropologist who's written extensively about this, dates it to 1984, that in Rajasthan there was this women's development program, which was the first explicit effort to really create a program that would be aimed towards women's empowerment, but led by the state, right? So it's no longer in the realm of the social movements. It's now led by the state. During the same time period, you have NABARD, the National Agricultural Rural Development Board, right, who really spearheaded microfinance in India. They are starting to set up self-help groups, which were just linking small groups of women to banks. This was the earliest version of microfinance in India, also with an empowerment agenda. So increasingly, you're starting to see, right, a convergence between these more radical articulations at the beginning and these more hegemonic kind of efforts to turn that into something policy-oriented. Okay, so all of this is happening really in the political sphere and with significant impacts in public life, right? And so there have been a huge number of changes as a result of this and other efforts. I sort of talked about the early period, but certainly these efforts have proliferated beyond, right? So we see more women than we did in the 70s and 80s in political office and in public life, right? And more recently, right, relating to the Smash the Patriarchy, the more recent articulations, you see a lot of more awareness about various forms of gendered violence in India, right? So these are all big improvements that I think we can trace back or at least make a connection to some of those earlier efforts towards empowerment that were mobilized in the 70s and 80s. But in all of this, there has been something of a silence or a blind spot, right? Women in the workforce, right? So all of the articulations about women's empowerment have been focused on the political sphere, which is absolutely crucial, right? I'm definitely not going to say that it's not, but there has been this oversight where we haven't had the same kinds of attention to women's livelihoods and women's work overall. Many of you might be familiar with this rather disturbing graph, right? That during the same time period that you see empowerment discourses circulating, filtering throughout India, you have had a decline, a rapid decline, especially since the early 2000s, in women's labor workforce participation, right? Coming to an all-time low in 2012, at least for this time period, making a little bit of a rebound, but still very low overall. To give some context to this, the most, 2017 is not there, listed some, it's because it's every other, but the most recent data, the 27.1% number, puts India at about 163rd in the world out of 180 countries. So, right, there's been a huge fall. Now, I'm not a quantitative demographer, so I'm not able to explain all of this difference, but I do think there's some context that we can explore to understand this dip and this sort of troubling trend in more detail. So what else is happening during this time period? Empowerment discourse is filtering out, right? But the service economy is also rising in India and throughout the world. Now, when I talk about the service economy, I'm referring to an economy that is structurally reliant on services rather than on manufacturing and agriculture. And in India, this is debatable. I'll get to that in a second. But this rise of the service economy is particularly significant in the US. Right? So the US transitions from an industrial economy in the 70s, right, 60s, 70s, and then because of outsourcing and various actually financialization changes, right, there's a huge shift and the US becomes a bifurcated, polarized service economy with kind of technology, finance, healthcare to some extent at the top, right, and kind of shit retail jobs at the bottom, right, with very little opportunities for advancement, right, feminized work at the bottom and more masculine work at the top, but women have those opportunities too. Now, in India, there's another version of that has taken place, right? It's not exactly the same, right, but certainly these trends have had influence. In India, right, you have tech and finance still at the top. These are highly professionalized service fields that require a great deal of, education, professional credentials. It's a, long process to be able to get into one of these fields, but huge growth in terms of opportunity. But then you also have at the bottom, right, a huge expansion in service type professions, so retail, but also things like domestic work continue to be dominant throughout, right? So this is what we see in India. Now, of course, in India, it's not completely a service economy. We still have a lot of manufacturing and agriculture, right? But I think it's fair to say that there has been a huge expansion in these two ends of the economy in India as well. Now, the expansion of this service economy also came with certain promises about how it would be good for these new opportunities would be good for women, right? So the idea was that, right, women would be able to work kind of clean IT jobs and that would be empowering for them. And at the other end of the economy, right, that working class women would be able to gain access to microfinance and be able to engage in new kinds of livelihoods than they were before, right? That was kind of the promise of it. So what I'm going to do now is, drawing from kind of my two research projects, I want to look at these two ends of the service economy in India, right, and try to think about whether the fantasies of women's empowerment that were projected upon these two areas, how they actually play out on the ground. Right? And so what I want to argue, or hope to convince you of, is that women's empowerment in the service economy has we haven't gotten there yet, right? Because women's unpaid or underpaid domestic roles are reinforced at both ends of this polarized economy, undermining women's positions in the workforce and compromising anything like women's empowerment that might be meaningful today. So let's start by looking at the top. Right? So when I started looking at gender and IT in the early 2000s, there was a spate of truly fantastical imagery about what Indian IT would bring Indian women. So this is a cover story by Daniel Pink in the magazine Wired that I literally saw standing in line at the grocery store one day, right? And it featured this woman whom I ended up meeting through the course of my research quite by coincidence. Here was another image that was widely circulated at the time. This is 2006, the previous one was 2005. So these images, right, spoke of an ascension that not only Indian women would experience, but that India was also ascending to a global stage along with these women, right? And so there was a lot of hope and promise that middle-class Indian women, when they got these IT jobs, would not only be empowered themselves, but would also raise the profile of India as a whole, right? But what I found in my research conducted over several years is that at this upper end of the service economy, the reality is that women entering IT face an extremely sex-segregated economy, right? And an extremely sex-segregated workplace. Right, and what do I mean by a sex-segregated workplace? I mean that different aspects of IT work are largely dominated by people of different genders. So for example, technical writing, human resources, right? These kinds of quality and management, these are women-dominated areas of IT. They have fewer opportunities for advancement, they're lower in status, and they don't have as demanding hours, right? There's all of these things. However, the high-status IT work, which we're talking about product coding, strategic decisions, management, these all continue to be male-dominated, right? And you could see it even in the geography of the workplaces that I had looked at, right? So if you go from one floor to the other, one floor, so in a firm that I looked at, 80% of the technical writers were women, 90% of the human resources staff were women, right? But then you go to where the coding is happening and there's only 20% women, right? So this is sex segregation, right? Where different kinds of work are being configured as masculine or feminine and being rewarded differentially as a result. Also, surprisingly low odds of long-term advancement, right? I constantly encountered people at all levels either expecting to leave the workforce within 5 years or struggling to return or stay past that 5-year mark. And this had to do with a whole set of expectations both within the workplace as well as outside the workplace that women must put their families before their careers, and that they also must be ready to migrate at any time with their male counterpart. And because of that willingness, also have to compromise their own careers. And I want to make a plug for Amy Bhatt's new book, High Tech Housewives. It just came out with the University of Washington Press. And she talks about this in a little bit more detail, looking at spouses who migrated from India with IT husbands, right? And how the way that the H-1B visa regime is set up, it requires a breadwinning man and a housekeeping woman to even work, right? So if one spouse has to be on that H-1B, then the other one, and it's typically the wife, right, has to give up her right to work in the U.S., right? And some of those restrictions have changed under Obama. I'm not sure what the status of them is now, right? But that entire visa structure shapes migration and shapes the kind of opportunities that women have as well. So let me give you some idea of what this looks like from the voices of different women that I interviewed myself. So I want to start with someone I call Gautami. She's 26 years old, a graphic designer in Mumbai. Right? And she said, around 35 or 40, when you're rising up the ladder, I'd prefer to settle down with my family and husband. Note that she's not married at the time that I speak to her, but she's expecting this will be in her future. And she says, ultimately, it's your family for whom you're doing it. If they're not happy, then ultimately it doesn't really make any difference. It's better to spend time with them and make them happy rather than earning money and money and money and nothing else. Right? So she's articulating here a kind of voice of propriety and morality, that she is a woman who is career-oriented, but is also willing to put that aside, to put aside any desire for materialism or earning endless money in order to prioritize her family first, because that is the most important value that she has been raised with. So clearly there are pressures from outside the workplace that shape women's aspirations in this field, but those constraints also come from within the workplace, right? So Malini, age 30, a little bit older, project lead. She's been in the field for about 5 years at the time that I talked to her. And she says about her company, I know they don't like it when a woman is in their face, right? They expect you to be a little bit womanly. Our common thought around here is that women don't want to be around, that they have a lot of other things to keep them busy, right? And so notice here that there's an assumption, right? And I haven't done recent research on this, but my understanding, just sort of updating my knowledge on it, is that things haven't changed a ton, right? But the expectation is that women prefer being mothers, right? And therefore they are expected within the workplace, sometimes even before they are mothers, that they have other things that they would rather be doing than work. And so the entire workplace is arranged with that set of expectations in mind. And what is expected of individual women is also tailored with that mothering expectation in mind. Okay, now a really interesting thing, and I'll come back to this again when I talk about microfinance, is that the very policymakers who are trying to combat these types of worrying trends and create policies to make them better, often end up blaming the women themselves, right? So let me give you an example. Padmini, a chief diversity officer at a company that I call Datacom, right, articulated something that I heard from a lot of program officers, diversity officers, whom I spoke to. She says, the problem with Indian women is that we've never been independent in our life. It's a very vicious cycle, right? So your parents decide what to do, and then your husband decides what you should do. It's easy to frame policies. We have them all. You name it, one year childcare sabbatical, part-time, flexi-time, daycare. But the major mindset that we need is only from women. Most of the time, they're confused. And if you don't want to bring a change, so we forget that the women themselves are part of this change, and if they don't want to bring the change, then it will never happen. Right? So I found this discourse among many of the policymakers, right, that there's something about Indian culture, that there's something about the women themselves, that they're just not stepping up to the opportunities that are being made available to them, rather than thinking about, okay, what is it about what we are valuing in the workplace that makes them feel that this work is not worth staying for, right, that they're not be able to see a future for themselves. Okay, so that's a little bit sort of thumbnail sketch of what's going on at the upper end. So now let's shift gears and look at the lower end. Right? So there's a similar but equally familiar fantasy around microfinance work, right? So many of you will be familiar with it. A woman gets a loan, right? Starts a small business, saves some money, is able to send her kids to a better school, have them get a better education, and eventually help her family rise out of poverty, right? Everyone familiar with this? How many people have heard this fantasy many, many times, right? It is a common one, and it is widely trafficked in development spaces, perhaps the most popular myth that we have out there, right? Okay, somehow my clicker is not working now. Let's go back here. Okay, however, right, the reality that I found in my research with commercial microfinance clients is that these clients really gain access to their loans because of their status as mothers, which makes them better financial risks. Right? The interest isn't necessarily so much in extending credit to women, but in extending credit to families, whereby women's roles as mothers, their expected role as mothers, is reinforced and rewarded. Right? So here's the first, so let's think about who MF clients are, microfinance clients are. They are not usually entrepreneurs. They are domestic workers, factory workers, agricultural workers. And when they apply for that microfinance loan, that group loan, they must write down their husband's name, his wage, right? They are already in the mind of the microfinance institution and in the documentation, they are already a homemaking woman who is the spouse of a breadwinning husband, right? Even in cases where the husband, they are the main breadwinners, right? But that construction and that set of expectations still constrains the way that they operate, right? And so very few of these women are actually entrepreneurs. And in fact, what I found is that, and this is consistent with a lot of literature that's out there and quite well known, is that access to loans can often end up trapping them in low-wage work. Right, because the fantasy, think about the kinds of work that we have in that fantasy about a microfinance client who does well, right? She's doing kind of small, low, not so scalable work, low wage work at home, right? And so these can actually, having these loans, when they take them up, can trap them in low wage work permanently, blocking their access to other kinds of opportunity. And in some cases, it can also, and this has been very well documented in the literature, that women can get trapped in debt cycles where the taking and repaying of loans in itself becomes a kind of unsustainable livelihood. So I'm going to give you just one example from my research. Ambuja of Kabul Bairasandra, a slum neighborhood in Bangalore, former garment worker, also age 26 when I met her. Right? I want to give you a little bit of background about her. So she worked at a garment factory, met her husband at this garment factory. They fell in love, they got married against the wishes of his parents, and now they have a toddler daughter. So when I interview her, there's a toddler daughter running around, and she's very happy that she's quit the garment factory. But she's taken 2 MFI loans from 2 different organizations, which is the maximum that you can take by law. Any more, and she would be disqualified. So she says, now I can do the housework and take care of the baby, and I get money. So this is better than garment work. I'm 100% happy. I want to expand my business rather than go back to work outside my home. I want to improve step by step. It's not possible to come forward in one single step. So today, if they give me 100 rupees and they give me an extra 20 rupees tomorrow, it's sufficient, right? So is microfinance having an impact here? Sure, right? She seems really happy, but it's also rewarding her work within her home and blocking her access to something outside of it. I'm not saying the garment work was a great thing, right? Obviously, she left it because it wasn't such it had a lot of constraints and was grueling in many ways, right? However, it was a long-term, more stable job. And what was she doing? She was selling saris door to door. And if anyone has been in a slum area in India, you would know that a lot of women have installment sari businesses where they kind of, and it's the most common thing that women do with their microfinance loan. So the idea that she's going to sell enough saris on an installment basis to not only pay off these loans, but to earn a stable livelihood for herself, there's pretty low odds of that happening, right? And yet, in her mind, she views the income, the constant income from microfinance, as income, as money, rather than loans, and it becomes the taking and giving of loans becomes a kind of livelihood that traps her in that low-wage position. Okay, and now what Ambuja has experienced is not out of what. It's not beyond the expectations of microfinance policymakers who have a very specific set of ideas about what women should be doing in mind. So I want to talk to you about Shankaran. He's a veteran microfinance policymaker. He's been working on microfinance policy since the early days at NABARD and now sits on the board of many commercial microfinance firms, right? And he says, if she, the microfinance client, says, I have given the money to my husband, he's running his auto rickshaw, he requires the money, then isn't that empowering gender? Look, finally the food has come to the table, the woman has become functional for getting that done, she gains her space, her respect, food comes to the table for everyone. What's the question that we've got to ask? This is not a feminist agenda that we are driving here, it's a livelihood agenda where both of them have a contribution to make and the household feels it is better off comparatively. Right? So the household that he has in mind, right? He's thinking about the household as a whole, which is helpful, right? He's thinking about both men and women as a cohesive unit, right? But he is also figuring that the woman is not working, that she has no economic stake without this MFI loan, right? And so that kind of prototypical notion of what these households look like is driving microfinance policy in his mind. Right? And yet for women like Ambuja who were economically active, and most of the women that I interviewed, all the women were economically active outside of these loans, right? They are now being constrained to this type of a role within their household because of the way that microfinance is actually set up, right? Okay, so now moving on to a parallel to Padmini, the folks who actually run the programs that are meant to empower women. So I want to introduce you to Maya. She runs a client education program at the time that I was doing research with a large microfinance institution. And what they did is they actually interfaced with clients. It's the kind of thing that you would think is a great idea for microfinance clients. They would go and do specific training and get microfinance clients to be understand a little bit more about how to run a business, how to scale their businesses, think about marketing, right, and really assert their identity as entrepreneurs, right? And so she described a situation in an interview where she was in a room with 22 women who had gathered, and all of them, one of the women in the group had received a very large order from Saudi Arabia to do embroidery on burqas. And this member was complaining to the facilitator that she couldn't get any women to help her with this. It was an enormous order, like 4,000 burqas. And then Maya goes in and looks at all of their registration cards and looks around at the group and finds that, in fact, several women in the group have listed that they are embroiderers. And so, so she goes and tells them, I just stood up and I said, look, Husseina is asking for 5 tailors who can do embroidery for her. Why are you sitting quiet? Instantaneously, your empowerment and your motivation should be to just stand up and get that order. What is it that's made you keep quiet? And then she addresses one of the women in particular. So she said, nothing great that I'm doing. So I thought, should I put that on paper? And then I realized, this is Maya speaking again, they're shy to disclose their identity as an entrepreneur. So Maya sees this entirely as a failure in confidence, right? That the women don't know how amazing they are, otherwise they would sit and embroider these burqas. But in my fieldwork, I found that women were very clear that embroidery was not worth it to them, that the work was so devalued that they could work the whole day, right, and make an outfit. And they would not be able to recover the cost of materials because everyone wants a deal on that. Right? That it's such labor-intensive work, so devalued, that it wouldn't be worth it to them. Maybe there are people who aren't confident. I'm not saying no, right? But there are certainly plenty of people for whom this just would not have been a worthwhile task, right? That the opportunities that were available were so limited, so small, that they would rather not engage in them at all, right? So again, here at that lower end, you have policymakers and program leaders really blaming the women themselves as having some kind of shortcoming, which is not allowing them to access the really great programs and policies that they have offered for them. Okay, so what do we make out of this as a whole? So what I'm trying to argue here is that the polarized service economy has really left women behind, both at that upper end and at that lower end. So why might this be? So a few different reasons. What I'm arguing is that the work of mothering in both sectors continues to be unpaid or underpaid. And I would add to that that in parallel, there's been no transformation in what counts as valued work within these spaces, right? So mothering is valued as unpaid work, right? But not valued in terms of its economic benefit, not valued in terms of the impact that it could have for transforming work within a given workplace of any kind. Now, the second factor is respectability politics, and I've written extensively about this with regard to my first project on IT, but it shows up in the microfinance space as well. Right? So respectability politics certainly reward women for staying at home. There's a way in which women can enact propriety and good Indianness, especially in the middle class, when they stay out of the workforce. But there is some evidence from the literature that this can change with better work opportunities. Naila Kabir did some classic research on garment workers in Bangladesh and showed that in a highly conservative culture, as soon as there were better opportunities for women to earn wages, then discourses of respectability were actually quite malleable, that they could change and shift to accommodate new opportunities for women, right? So I think we can have a discussion about that. It's a factor, but I think it's more malleable than people imagine. And then finally, and this kind of goes back to a point that I meant to make earlier, although I don't know if I did, right, is that it's pretty clear, and some new research is showing that there have been, that expansion that's taken place at both ends has not been matched by an expansion of jobs in the middle, where moderately educated women, particularly in urban areas, would have a set of opportunities that would be appealing to them, that would be helpful to them, and that would be, an engaging career to pursue. Okay, so if we now revisit women's empowerment, this tired concept that I'm hoping to kind of shed some new light on, right? That what we're at a moment now that it requires rethinking the gender divisions that structure paid and unpaid work, right? And that includes this whole host of binaries: public, private, work, home, economy, and family. At both ends of the service economy, right, we still have a setup that values everything on the left, right, and devalues everything on the right, even though all of the terms on the right sustain and make possible everything on the left, right? And so I think there's a larger discussion to be had about how do you actually address those fundamental binaries. Can the meaning of work be restructured in a way that destabilizes these binaries that structure our understanding of work? And then secondly, women's empowerment discourse and praxis, in my view, tends to overlook the everyday experiences of women at both ends, whether they're at the top end, supposedly doing very well, or whether they're at the bottom end. There are similar structural features of the workplace and their social milieus that they face, and those connections, I think, can be instructive for us thinking about women's equal access to the labor market. So finally, just to conclude, the individual and political empowerment of women, which I think we've made some progress on, is certainly powerful, but I argue that it's ultimately compromised without economic empowerment, and we have to rethink what economic empowerment means. It's not just about bringing women into the workforce, but making the work, restructuring what the workforce is. Right? True economic empowerment means a reconceptualization of what is valued and what constitutes paid work. And we're only at the very beginning, I think, of starting to think about what that might look like. And diversity policies, right, empowerment programming at both ends don't go far enough to address these kinds of questions. Without a stake in the workforce and fair work that rewards education, women of all class backgrounds will only be able to partly participate in society. Right, and that leaves all of us worse off than we could be. And so, I'll end there, and I look forward to your questions. Yes.
Thanks for a great talk, and I'm sorry that we haven't reached the point that the first person asking the question is a woman. But one thing that I did wonder about in the data that you've got and what you've looked at is you focus very much on the role of motherhood.
Yeah.
And whether you'd looked at distinctions, particularly with the involuntary childless, and whether you kind of dug into your data in that area.
Yeah, that's a great question. So at both ends, I encountered those folks who decided not to have children, and they feel constrained. Is that, yeah? Oh, you said involuntary childhood. Involuntary.
Because
yes.
Because it's not just at the level of, in the economically engaged sort of part of society, but actually, reflecting on our own situation, myself and my wife, now we're realizing that me as an older professional man, I have I can sort of adopt a particular role, and yet she finds, my wife finds that her friends, the primary role that is easily available is the grandmother.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't done specific research about that topic, but I think it's becoming increasingly relevant It's become very visible at the high end, and with a lot of discussion about anxiety about fertility and sort of that sort of centrality of motherhood in middle class culture has come up a lot in that IT space. I haven't had those kinds of discussions with women at the other end, but I think if I were to speculate a little bit about what that would look like, I think that you're right that in both of those situations, regardless of class context, that women feel marginalized and alienated from both economic, political, social opportunity as a result of not having that mothering role, right? And so I think there that anyway. That's another. Absolutely. It's hard to find them. It's hard to, and for me, methodologically, I went from the organizations, right? And so that already only gives me access to the people who are engaged in them and reaping those benefits. And it's very difficult to find the others. So I think you would need like a radically different methodological strategy. Thank you.
Question over here? Right here.
Okay, thank you.
To what extent do you know or could you speculate on what is similar or different in the U.S. context?
Oh, great. Yes, there are lots of similarities in the U.S. context. I think I have a slide about that. Okay, see. So
perfect.
Right. So this situation that I'm talking about is definitely not unique to India. It's something which in the U.S. The end of the Cold War meant that the U.S. model of the nuclear family really won out, right, over a Soviet solution to a collectivization of childcare and so on, right? And it won out for other reasons other than the fact that that didn't work out. But when that nuclear family model really won out in the U.S., it spread elsewhere throughout the world. And I think in the U.S. you see a very similar kind of polarization at the top end and at the bottom end. I think the way that it plays itself out at the bottom end in the U.S. labor market, it's not financially driven, right? It's not microfinance that's sort of reaching out, but I think you see it in low-wage work, workfare, all kinds of other arrangements that are, engaging low-wage women, but doing it in ways that don't allow for any kind of upward mobility, don't allow for extensive training, don't allow for them to get out of that lower segment. Yeah. I think there was a question over here. You had she's at.
I think George has been waiting.
Oh, okay. So thank you. What fantastic talk. I was the IT engineer that you had up on the slide a while ago articulated that the money was the main reason to work, and then if the money was not enough, then why do it?
Yes.
And I was wondering if you related respectability politics to identity politics in a way that respectability derives from identity and the other way around, such that a male person would a male person frame it in the same way that their only reason to be in the workforce is the money? Or would identity be tied to what you do? And how does that tie in with respectability? Is money the only reason why one might want to work?
Yeah, so that's a great set of questions. In the narratives of the women that I interviewed, right, that was a way of dismissing or diminishing the value of being in the workforce, right, by saying that, oh, it's just about the money. Now, men have full license to pursue the money, right? That kind of like, I will follow the very best job and earn as much money as I can for my family, and my wife and everybody else just needs to follow along with that. That would be a perfectly acceptable thing for a man to say, but not for a woman to say, right? And so that I identified that particular quote as a discourse of morality that circulated to really justify the curbed aspirations of women who were talking about life decisions they hadn't even encountered yet, right? Like, so here's a woman prior to even meeting a man that she's going to marry, having any of these kinds of decisions, has already decided, I'm never going to choose work over family, right? Because that's not what I do. And so going back to your original question about, how does respectability relate to identity? For a lot of women, right, those decisions, they're socialized into an environment where they need to make those decisions. And then if they do find some success at work and they find that rewarding, right, and they're enjoying it, then they have to revisit that, and there's some tension there. right? And I don't think once those, like Gautami, I'd be curious if I could track her down, 6 years later, did she actually drop out, right? We don't know. She might have encountered a dilemma that really pushed back against that idea a little further down the line in her career, right? So I think all those things are tied together, and women have license, or men have license to say things about pursuing prosperity, and again, whether or not it's justified by the family. And you'll hear men, I interviewed a lot of men who said, well, I just go where the best work is, the most interesting work, and that's what I'm really after, and the money is secondary. So they have their own morality discourses, their own ways of expressing their masculinity and competence. But this is the way that respectable femininity gets articulated.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. And I think this is an area where sociology and geography kind of get together.
Yes.
Linda McDowell's work has been
Yes.
really influential in the space. My question is around some of the points about unpaid labor that you've got up there. We had a really interesting PhD project by Felicity Butler, who was working with the Body Shop in actually piloting pricing unpaid community work into value chains for sesame and for coffee in Nicaragua.
Oh,
and this is the Body Shop basically exploring whether or not they can actually price unpaid labor that goes in, including some household labor, into those pricing in their community trade programs. And one of the things we found was actually it wasn't just enough to price it in, and it was fascinating that a business was ready to do that.
That's great.
The next question was how the funds would actually reach the women.
Right.
And we had these multiple additional layers. So obviously an individualistic paradigm would give it to the woman individually, and she would just make her choices. This is a strongly cooperative dominated environment in Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. So it was the male dominated cooperatives that wanted to define how the money was used.
Absolutely.
And even where it reached the women, it was then the household, often again male dominated heads of households, that would make the decisions for them. So in a sense, there's another step there.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering how you would, even in a research environment or indeed in policy recommendations, link together the fact that on the input side, you need to, in a sense, recognize some of that labor, but then also in the receptor side, you need to recognize the structures of decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a direct, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think like that initial step of recognizing and remunerating unpaid labor is a first step, right? But it certainly doesn't address the problem entirely. And I mean, household economics has this long and storied history of trying to explode that black box of the household and really get into the power dynamics there and think about bargaining power. And I think there's a lot there that can be linked with this, right? And so I don't even, I feel like it's not, I don't do that kind of work, but I think there's a lot of literature that thinks, especially in household economics, that's trying to get into those, that might be really relevant in those types of contexts where we're thinking about, okay, how do we then remunerate unpaid work? But thank you for that, it was really interesting.
Hi, it was really nice listening to you. I have two questions that I want to ask and focus on. In your data, at the top end, when you were looking at women...
Can you hold the mic a little closer? Yeah.
At the top end, when you were looking at those women, did you come across aspects of contractualization and informalization of work and its impact on women's participation in the workforce?
I'm not able to hear your question very... So at the top end in IT, did I encounter informalization?
There is a whole trend towards contractualization of work that is taking place.
Yes.
I'm wondering, how did you come across this and how was it impacting women's participation? And the second thing is that with the increased focus of on childcare leave, on various norms like maternity leave, toilets, and various infrastructure, there's a lot of talk about let's not hire women. So what I'm asking you is the larger context and how was it influencing women's participation? What did you find in your study? At the lower end, increasingly with self-help groups and the National Livelihood Mission being the major force in the formation of these, their perspective and take, as you were saying, is primarily on livelihoods. They're not looking at it as an empowerment tool at all. So it's a side thing that will happen. Now, I'm asking you, did you come across these macro contexts and how were they impacting and how the women were negotiating this in your studies?
Okay, that's a big question. There are two different things, and I have a lot to say. Let me start with the second part. As far as what's happening at the lower end in this microfinancial context, I think you were talking about what are the different livelihoods, how are women kind of responding to this context. So I have a recent paper in economic anthropology where I talk about the organizing work that women do in this that's also unpaid, right? So it's not just the fact that women are getting together for these loans. They're getting together for 18 different kinds of loans, right? And they understand all the different rates and the things that they have to do. They're key members of the community that organize all of that, and they do it without pay, right? They're the ones who understand the micro context that the microfinance organizations want. So there's all kinds of unpaid labor that is enabling commercial microfinance as well as self-help finance to do the work that they're doing, right? It's not just the organizations that they're doing. The women in the communities are mobilizing their knowledge of one another in very specific ways to make those risk pools work, right? So I think there's a whole side to that that's going on. At the upper end, so when you're talking about contractualization, you're talking about domestic work and kind of women outsourcing their unpaid labor to domestic workers. Was that what you were referring to? Right, in the workplace.
So it's in the workplace that, is it that not impacting women's employment and their, because the macro context is actually pretty negative.
Yes.
And in many areas,
Very
like IT workers who are staying back late, they have to give them taxi fare. You have to monitor whether they have reached home with the cases of rape and other things that have come up in India.
Yeah.
I was wanting to know what came up in your study.
Yeah, so my data is old in the sense that it was kind of at the dawn of gender diversity policies. So those kinds of lactation centers and childcare centers and all that were just kind of coming up. So I'd be interested to see now the extent to which women are availing of those. But at the time that I was doing it, when those existed, women were still often hesitant to use those kinds of services for a whole host of reasons, right? Not trusting it. There's a lot of skepticism about non-family members taking care of kids. Even if the women are okay with it, then someone else in the family is not okay with it. So there's a whole range of contexts that women are trying to navigate in figuring out how they're going to do motherhood in collaboration with holding down a job, and women really bear the primary burden for figuring that out. Nowhere in any of these conversations is there a discussion about, okay, how can both men and women be involved in even just figuring out how we're going to do it, right? That really hasn't come into the conversation at all. There's so much pressure on women to figure out all of this by themselves that it is overwhelming. And I mean, what Padmini talked about as, well, the women are confused, they haven't planned well, right? I mean, there's no consideration that, it's a shared problem, right? I mean, having kids is burdensome for men and women, but there's the assumption at every level is that women have to figure all of this out, and it is overwhelming for women, and I don't think that there's a straightforward way in which they can either utilize or not utilize. In many cases where they have those kinds of, creches and so on within workplaces, they're not utilized so much. Some of the case studies that I've read about factory work, for example, where creches are provided at daycare, at the workplaces, women do tend to utilize those. So, there's definitely like a PhD or the scope for a study about how those arrangements affect women of different classes. There's a lot of potential there. So anyway, sorry, I went on a bit long for that.
Hi. You can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. And I work on financial inclusion and in rural context. So both my questions will be on that. The first one is on digitization and in financial services. So we've seen a big push to digital finance in the last 5 to 10 years. Yep. I'm very curious about what you think is the impact on women's autonomy, intra-household and in the village as a consequence of digitization, because currently we have quite the narrative is that it's very empowering, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So that's kind of a micro question. A macro macro question is simultaneously in India, especially in rural India, we see that most people, there's 42% by the last annual employment survey of people are seasonally employed.
Yeah.
So, and simultaneously we've seen the agricultural market kind of collapse, right? So therefore a lot of clients in microfinance, both men and women, but mainly women obviously, they're kind of using additional ways to plug that gap. Men can migrate, obviously. State-supported schemes like Narega, these have an impact. But I'm curious to see if you, like, you know, because we have the services sector extension, but in rural India where microfinance is quite, you know, rapid, that necessarily that migration pattern doesn't reflect. So how does the gender dynamic operate in that context?
Okay, so so I'll say something quickly about the digitization part of it. So in my work, and this has clearly changed quite a bit in the last 2 years since demonetization. But you know, in the research that I did a little bit just prior to demonetization, specific MFIs weren't necessarily thinking. Some of them used tablets, some of them didn't. They didn't. The actual way that women were interacting with their MFI loans was not digital in character. It was quite manual. They had to bring specific papers. And I mean, I had been to so many house visits where, you know, they're literally looking at pieces of paper and saying, this is not the original Aadhaar card, we can't use it. You know, this is a copy, I can see it's a color copy. It's not. So they're really like in this really grainy, nitty-gritty kind of interactions with stuff. It's not clean, frictionless digitization at all. Sometimes the MFI officers, and I have a lot of work on the officers, because I actually think one of the most interesting stories about microfinance are the workers themselves. And they have been in some, so like Equitas is one, and there's a few MFIs that have really gone completely committed to all digital transmission, but it's not as widespread as you would think, right? And there are all kinds of processes within the distribution of microfinance loans that seem to me to be quite manual, more so than I expected. So I don't know what other kinds of digital financial services women like the ones I interviewed would be receiving now, because I know there's been more uptake of mobile devices and so on, but you know, that's an empirical question. I didn't see much of it, even, you know, 2012, 2014. I still think it was not something that was widespread. And then the other question that you asked about rural areas, so most of my work was in urban areas, so I don't know that much about the rural space. I ended up interviewing a bunch of leaders who are leaders of rural MFIs when I started thinking about the MFI space more broadly. But I think the common thread between both of them is that microfinance becomes a livelihood strategy that can shore up and be used, you know, along with other kinds of work, whether it's NREGA. When I was studying that empowerment training program, there was a lot of concern among trainers that, oh, now because of NREGA, they're just going to go work instead of coming to our great empowerment program. And I was a little bit like, and why is that a bad thing, right? But for them, they sort of saw it as being in conflict, right? And that you know, why would they go to NREGA when they can come and be empowered to be entrepreneurs? But to the women themselves are like, why would I be an entrepreneur? Like, I'm not interested. Maybe my daughter can take it up, right? So a lot of these economic decisions don't make sense to the people who are distributing programming related to microfinance. But I think there's a whole other side to it that has not been explored.
Thanks. Fantastic talk. I was kind of trying to steal like my last question from Neha. So I have a quick question about the class and caste dynamics that might play in women employing other, you know, women to, at least particularly in the urban areas, to kind of do the work. And I'm just eager to see what's your perspective on how that how that plays out.
Can you clarify? So women employing other women, are you talking about domestic work?
Yeah, domestic work. Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole, I mean, I think that the common thread here is that, right, IT women may be actually, they're hiring microfinance clients, right, to do the domestic work so that they can go to their IT jobs, right? So there is actually an in-person connection between these two worlds, and domestic work is the link between both of them. And I think that would be interesting to explore further. I don't have data on caste per se, because it's with the IT stuff, I think I can infer caste in certain ways. In the microfinance space, the clients that it's very difficult to kind of infer and discuss caste in a thoroughgoing way. So I don't have a good answer to that, but I think there's real scope here to do a more intersectional analysis of how work and class and caste opportunities work together. Particularly in MFIs, a lot of the hiring is done through family connections, which would then exclude, which would be caste specific. So I think there's a lot there that can be done. So I know we're out of time.
We are. I was trying to signal to David because he wants to ask a question, I think, but we really don't have time. So David, I'm going to ask you to meet with Smitha during the break. So let's take a 15-minute break and then come back for the first paper session. But before that, let's give Smitha a huge round of applause.
Thank you.